Hey everyone, welcome to another episode. Today we're going to go over two of the bigger fears that people have in wanting to even go through the exit planning process. I think in some circles, exit planning is even considered a little bit of a dirty word. There's some fears that arise when you talk about that. So Holly, why don't you try to frame up this conversation and then we'll dive in. I think we're going to talk about two of the specific fears today.
Yeah, so there's really three elements that impact people when they're thinking about exiting their business. And there's is the company ready and is it at the value that you want it to be? And then there's the personal financial side, but the harder of the three elements is really the psychological and mental aspect. And it's more intangible. It's a little harder to overcome. So I think it's good to dive into that a little bit and talk about it.
All right, very good. So I think the first one is certainly more mental, and I think what we wanted to talk about was the idea of freedom versus control. So why don't you help us define that a little bit on what do we mean by freedom and what do we mean by control, and how are those things how can those things be opposed to one another?
Well, one of the things that we help owners work toward is financial freedom. And what does that look like? How do we define freedom? How much money do they need to be free? But then there's also freedom from stress, and there's freedom from the burden of running a company and the financial responsibility and the schedule. But along with that, there's a trade-off. And the trade-off has to do with control and some of the real drivers behind why we get into business and become entrepreneurs to begin with. I know one of the reasons that I started in this business is I really wanted to be able to control my destiny more. And I felt like if I worked in a corporate environment, I would be more subject to the whims of others and, managers and career track and politics and things like that. And so some of the ways that we're wired make it very hard to let go of when it comes time to retire or walk away from the business.
Okay, so you're saying that we have this tension between being free from maybe some of the restraints people have in the corporate world, and then you want this sense of control along with that. So I think the issue then is, okay, if I'm going to sell my company, what is the impact on my freedom and my control then? Why might I be afraid to go down that road?
Yeah, I don't think most people sit around and consciously think about this.
Okay, yeah.
But what happens is that research shows that a majority of owners are very interested in exiting at some point and having an exit plan, but very few do. The numbers are 75% in recent research say they want to exit, but only 4% have an intentional plan.
So, okay, so there's this disconnect between like what people are saying that they want and what they actually follow through with. So we're trying to get to the bottom of maybe where that disconnect lies. And I think you're saying this is one of those areas that may be explaining that.
Yeah, because when we sit down and do the numbers for a lot of owners, they're financially free. I mean, if they were to walk away from their business and sell it, they have the money to support the lifestyle that they're hoping to support, but there's something else holding them back.
Okay.
And so it's really peeling back the layers and figuring that out. Like what is it exactly?
Okay. Yeah. And so that can be just loss of control in the sense that like you own a company and that you kind of like are responsible for the success and the failure, and you can kind of own that. Is that what you mean? Or is it more this sense? Because I think a lot of the owners that we're talking about, they have achieved that place. Certainly if they're financially free due to their business value, they've probably got to the place where they have relinquished a lot of the day-to-day operations in their company. So what is it What is it specifically that what is that control that they're holding on to? What does that mean?
Well, one part of it is that when most of our wealth is tied up in this illiquid asset, but it's also an asset that we understand and that we have driven to this point. Whereas if we sell the business, the money's going into investments and cash and other things that we may not be as familiar with. So that can feel like a loss of control.
Okay. So just the element of you have this, this large asset, this is the majority of your net worth, and you feel like you drive the value of that element versus if I then receive some cash and I go invest it. Now I may be what, we would say you're more diversified because you're able to purchase thousands of different companies and different financial instruments, but there's a sense that you don't have control over those companies. So there's this idea that may be risky or that may be scary because you've lost the ability to drive the value of those things.
Well, if you think about it, let's think about our company. We could set goals and then we can take action to work toward accomplishing those goals. And if we have an economic downturn, maybe we can cut back on some expenses, or maybe we can hustle a little more and, try to bring in more business. But if there's an economic downturn that causes our portfolio to adjust downward, we may feel like there's not a lot we can do about that. And so, that's a completely different dynamic. So there's that. And then there's also the idea that we started the business maybe as a technician, and then we started managing people, and then we started managing the long-term vision of the company and really growing it. But who's going to do that next? Who's the
Ah,
who's the next in line leadership that will understand how to operate the business and grow the business? Stepping away from that also can be scary, because once we hand the keys over to someone else, are they going to be able to do as well as we did?
yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think there's so that brings us to our second fear here, which is more about leadership and the talent pool that we're drawing from to be our successors, and sometimes there's some limitations there. And I think it's specifically heightened if there's going to be some kind of an earnout situation where you still have some like financial stake in the company, or if maybe it's a family business and now you're passing it on to the next generation. There's an element of like probably a financial stake you still have in it, but also there's like some I don't know, emotional stake you have in it. The next generation, there's a reflection on how you've done, and you're kind of handing the keys over to them. So I think there's in both of those situations, there can be some hesitation. So why don't you talk a little bit about the different types of leaders that we see in the second generation? And I'll just comment really quickly. I think what we often see is the person who started the company. They're the visionary. They have the one that kind of birthed this thing and grown it. And so that's often the visionary. In our business, Holly would be considered the visionary. She founded the company. And then you also have more of an integrator type of person who is, they're more the nuts and bolts, the business operations. They can see the ins and outs that maybe the visionary can't or doesn't want to. And so these kind of people complement each other very well. So oftentimes the second generation, though, or that person who may be the person you're closest to, or you work closely to, or you're now this maybe a partner with your firm, now all of a sudden you're handing the keys over and they may not have the same visionary qualities that you have, and that could be concerning. So I didn't want to steal your thunder, but I think that was a good tee up. So how would you talk a little bit about the differences in leadership styles?
Yeah, so I think we're a good example, and I think we've been very fortunate that we just kind of happen to find each other. But sometimes owners don't have that. They don't have the complementary person to help them, and they don't have the next in line leader that can really help them run the company. And like one example I can think of is a father and son that work together um, in a services business. And dad is the technical person. He's got the licensing. He's got the senior technical ability. Son is really good at operating things, really running the day to day of the company. But one of the things that really nags at the dad is he doesn't see the son really doing the business development and going out and building the relationships and more of the sales aspect of the business. And so he doesn't even consciously realize like what is bothering him about it, but I can see from afar that this is what he's concerned about. And so, the son is really doing a great job running the business. Um, but there's going to be a different element when dad retires, and that's a challenge. And then sometimes you have the opposite, where you have a visionary. Some of the key elements of visionaries is they're very big picture oriented and not necessarily detail oriented, and they're really focused on kind of creative and inspirational things, but they
And
may not.
they're the idea person. They're coming up with all the ideas. The integrator is the one that can look at it and say, "Oh, that's got legs. We can do that. We can get that into our company." Or they can say, "Hey, that may not work. Let's try something else." So this is an example of the complementary nature of these two type of
Well,
leaders in the company.
a lot of times a visionary, just out of coping mechanism or drive, they'll be that operations person,
Yeah.
but they don't really have somebody that they are letting go of that, or that even is capable. Like they may have somebody that functionally is good in some key areas of the company, but when it comes to like rising above the business and making sure all the pieces are functioning well and integrating,
Mm-hmm.
they don't have that person. And we've talked to businesses like that where they've really elevated different people into management roles, but they're still the overall operator, and they haven't really found that person that could do that operational piece of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Very good. Well, I think we've hit on the two big fears in terms of freedom and loss of control, and the leadership and having complementary talent in place. So, is there anything else we want to add to those in terms of just anything else we want to elaborate on before we wrap it up today?
Yeah, I think the last thing is the idea of moving away from or towards something.
Okay.
And if we're thinking about, okay, I want to move away from stress, I want to move away from busyness, I want to move away from not being available and accessible to my family, or to do the things that I want to do. That's very different from having a very intentional plan of what you're moving toward and what you want to do in a positive way. And so I think one way to solve some of these problems is to start focusing first on the toward, and think about, what is it I want to create in my future? And what's the next chapter going to look like? And then we can start backing into where the gaps are and figuring out, do I need to bring in a consultant? Do I need to have a a recruiting effort to bring in different layers of talent? But, really just figuring out what are the elements that are missing that need to be addressed. But I think, first of all, having that vision of where we're going.
Yeah, yeah, okay. All right, very good. Awesome. Well, I think it was a good conversation. I think the helping to dispel or maybe just normalizing these fears, I think should help our listeners out there just understand that, hey, that's just a part of the exit planning process, is that is getting over some of those mental hurdles. And these are two of the things we hear often from people in terms of as we're going through the process, or even like hesitation in starting it. Once they're open to sharing with us, we hear these two things often. So I think what we wanted to do is we actually have a exit planning questionnaire that I think that if you own a company and this conversation resonated with you, I think taking that questionnaire would be really, really valuable to kind of help you understand where you are. It just helps get a pulse of where you are in the process of selling. So Holly, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so it really is a self-assessment. It takes a couple minutes, and it measures how financially ready you think you are, as well as how mentally and psychologically ready you think you are. And it just helps see if there are gaps there that need to be addressed, and gives you a starting point to figure out what to do next.
Okay, awesome. All right, very good. Well, until next time, everyone, enjoy it.